Many fans of the Lord of the Rings franchise are most familiar with the last events of the Third Age, of the saga of the One Ring and the valor of the hobbits Bilbo and Frodo Baggins. But these last wars were but a flicker in time of the Third Age, a period that lasted some 3,000 years. For after the destruction of Numenor, Elendil and his sons led the remnants of the mighty Númenóreans to Middle-earth, where they established the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, the realms in exile. Though these realms would prosper for a time, the might of the Dúnedain would fade as the centuries passed, and the strength of men weakened as Sauron regained his powers. In this video, I will cover the history of the Third Age leading up to the Hobbit. In this time, Gondor, Arnor, and Rohan all come to the forefront, as the powers of the elves and even the dwarves fade from Middle-earth. Unfortunately, apart from the appendices of the book Return of the King, there is not a whole lot of information on the histories of these kingdoms. I've chosen to cover Arnor and Gondor separately rather than all in one chronological retelling, as all of the names and events can become rather confusing when jumbled together. Let's dive in. After the overthrow of Sauron, Isildur, now the High King of Gondor and Arnor, was counseled by Elrond and Círdan the Shipwright to destroy the ring in the fires of Mount Doom. But the malice and evil of Sauron remained in the ring, and Isildur was taken by it, instead claiming the ring as an heirloom for his house. He returned to Minas Anor and planted a new white tree in honor of his brother Anarion. The ring became ever dearer and precious to Isildur, and he decided to leave Gondor and take up the seat of power in Eriador in his father's realm. His wife and youngest son Valandil were left in Imladris. Thus, in the second year of the Third Age, the company of Isildur set out for Arnor, traveling along the northern edge of the Gladden Fields. There, however, they were ambushed by a large force of orcs. The tall and mighty Dúnedain fought valiantly, but they had been caught unawares and were massively outnumbered. The orcs pushed on, inspired, though unknowingly, by the presence of the One Ring carried by Isildur. In that moment, Isildur began to dread the power of the ring, and now knew it was far beyond his ability to control. Two of his sons, Cirion and Aratan, died in the battle, and he now sought to take the ring to the keepers of the three elven rings. Then Isildur made to escape, becoming invisible as he donned the One Ring. Behind him stayed Elendil, his eldest son, to cover his escape, and he fell with the rest of the Dúnedain. Isildur jumped into a river to flee from the orcs, but the ring betrayed him, slipping from his finger and exposing him. Isildur was shot with arrows, dying in the river Anduin. His body was never found, though later in the beginning of the Fourth Age the Elendilmere, a beautiful piece of elven crystal on a fillet of mithril, was discovered. It was a token of royalty of the northern kingdoms descended from Silmarien, daughter to Tar Elendil, the fourth king of Númenor. It implied at some point Isildur's body had been discovered, likely by the enemy who defiled it. And some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. History became legend. Legend became myth. Sauron by now was nonetheless believed to be vanquished, though the realm of men was now kingless. Of Isildur's party, there were only 3 survivors. One was LOTR, bearer of the shards of Narsil. He returned to Imladris and presented them to Valandil and Elrond, who foretold the sword would not be reforged until the One Ring was found and Sauron returned to Middle-earth. The Númenóreans were greatly diminished, and under the kingship of Valandil, many lands became ignored and discarded. Centuries passed, until when Eärendil became the 7th king after Valandil, the lands became divided into petty realms. These lands were called Arthedain, Rhudaur, and Cardolan. Arthedain proved to be the most stable of the 3, and was the only realm where the line of Isildur would survive. Furthermore, they became rivals, jostling for possession of Amansul and the lands west of Bree. This infighting further hastened the decline of the Númenóreans. Then came the reign of Malvagil of Arthedain, and during this time the evil realm of Angmar began to threaten the fractured kingdom of Arnor. Unknown to the men there, its lord was the Witch King, mightiest of Sauron's Nazgûl, who wished to destroy Arnor in its entirety. By this time, the line of Isildur was only alive in Arthedain, and their kings claimed lordship over all of Arnor. The petty realm of Rudar resisted this claim, for they had been ensnared under the lordship of evil men working with Angmar. And though Argaleb, son of Malvagil, fortified the Weather Hills, he fell in battle with Rudar and Angmar. Then Arveleg, his son, with the help of Cardolan and the elves of Lindon, fought the enemy back and held the border. However, in the year 1409 of the Third Age, the forces of Angmar assaulted Cardolan and encircled Weathertop. The Dunedain were soundly defeated, and Arveleg was killed, though the Palantir of Amansul was saved. They fell back to Fornost, where the young son of Arveleg, Arafor, fought a valiant defense with the help of Círdan. Elves from Lindon and now Rivendell also arrived to help the Dunedain, and the armies of Angmar were held off. Later, under the reign of Argaleb in the 17th century of the Third Age, a great plague devastated the remnants of Arnor, wiping out Cardolan. Then in 1974 of the Third Age, Angmar rose once more, and the Witch King himself fell upon Arthedain. Fornost was overrun, with King Arvedui fleeing to the mountains. He found shelter with the snowmen of Forelkel, and was eventually found by the ships of Círdan. Yet the snowmen warned him to not leave yet, for it was the end of winter, and the power of the Witch King would fade come summertime. However, Ardavui ignored their counsel and set out, and a great storm struck his ship. He perished in the sea, with his Palantir lost to the waves. Meanwhile, the Shire folk of hobbits, who lived within the borders of Arnor, survived through the war and became a self-governing people. They chose a Thane to replace the king, and the first of this name was Buka of Marish. For after the death of Ardavui, the northern king of Arnor fell, and the Dunedain of Eriador became few, if any. A small number survived, led by the chieftains of the Dunedain. First of these was Aranarth, son of Ardavui, and he claimed to his house the Ring of Barahir, the Shards of Narsil, the Star of Elendil, and the Scepter of Anu Minas. Yet now the Dunedain became a wandering people, with no kingdom to call home. Time passed, and though a watchful peace continued over Mordor, foul beings continued to befall the lands of the free peoples. Aragorn I was slain by wolves, and orcs began to establish strongholds in the Misty Mountains undetected. In 2509, they attacked the company of Celebrian, who by now was the wife of Elrond of Rivendell. Wounded, she fled back to Rivendell, where she was healed by her husband. However, the joy of Middle-earth left her, and the following year she passed over the sea to the Undying Lands. Elrond and his two sons, Eladan and Elrohir, stayed in Rivendell. The orcs continued to make bolder and bolder incursions into Middle-earth, and were fought off by the Dunedain, elves, and even a force of hobbits led by Bandobras Took. The chieftains of the north persisted for 15 generations, the last of their leaders being Aragorn II, who would eventually become King Elessar. It was during this time the hobbits came to be noticed more among the realms of men. They were a simple people of the earth, remaining largely in the background of the major events of the age, and content to live in carefree days. They were divided into three major groups: the Harfoots, who lived by the mountains, the Stoors by the river Anduin, and the Fallowhides. The Fallowhides were the most adventurous of the hobbits and friendliest with the elves, and it was from them descended the Tooks and the Masters of the Buckland. The hobbits for the most part lived in the northern reaches of the Anduin, before eventually crossing the mountains and settling in Eriador. There they had met the Dunedain of Arnor, and were allowed to establish several communities in the diminishing kingdom of the north. In 1601 of the Third Age, the Fallowhide brothers Marco and Blanco were permitted by King Argaleb II to cross the Bridge of Stonebows and claim the lands beyond. These hobbits thus moved west into the region that became known as the Shire, and effectively became independent from Arnor while still respecting the reign of the king. They sent a small battalion to the Battle of Fornost, but after the ruin of Arnor appointed a Thane until a king returned to the throne. The Shire was divided into north, east, south, and west farthings, and the families of hobbits largely tended to their own affairs. For 1,000 more years they lived in this manner, the Shire growing and prospering, and the hobbits fading out of the tales of Middle-earth. And they grew sheltered, forgetting the old histories and remaining content in their lands. As for the southern kingdom of Gondor, after the death of Anarion and the Sage of Barad-dûr, there were 31 kings. Their realm was relatively less troubled than Arnor, and though there was constant war at their borders, their realm would prosper until King Atanatar II. His son, Valastur, would be childless, for the Dunedain still faded, marrying late and having few children. Valakar's union with the Northmen was looked down upon by the people of Gondor, who saw them as a separate race. Unrest grew in the southern provinces, and rebellion began to break out. Many feared the introduction of non-Dunedain blood would further shorten the lifespan of the kings. Thus, when Valakar's son, Eldacar, came to the throne, there was the War of the Kinstrife. Eldacar fought stubbornly and doggedly against the rebels, but was driven out of Osgiliath, losing his palantir in the river. He fled north, for he was half Northman, and made it to his people in Rovanion. And Castamir, younger brother of Romendasil II, usurped the throne with the support of Umbar and Pelargir. But he was a cruel ruler, and 10 years later Eldacar flew out of the north, meeting Castamir in battle in Lebanon at the crossings of Erui. Castamir was slain by his hand, though his sons escaped with his ships and fled to Umbar. It became a separate kingdom and was at war with Gondor ever after. These corsairs constantly raided the southern region of the kingdom, and Gondor's lands became more diminished. The royal house of Gondor then became lessened, for it mixed with the blood of lesser men. Yet Eldacar lived to be 258 years old, ruling for 58 of those. However, war with the corsairs would be a thorn in his side, and his son Menardil would be killed in battle with the pirates. His son, Telemnar, succeeded him. Then, a plague struck the kingdom in 1634 of the Third Age, killing the royal family and many of the population. Many cities were abandoned, as well as the fortresses on the border of Mordor. The proud city of Osgiliath was abandoned, and Minas Anor, renamed to Minas Tirith, became the greatest bastion remaining in Gondor. In 1810, King Telúmatar raided Umbar and killed the descendants of Castamir, but the land was soon taken back from Gondor by the Haradrim. The Eotheod, who became known as the Rohirrim, were first a remnant of the Northmen, descendants of the first men in the first age of the world. They had a steadfast alliance with Gondor, protecting its northern and eastern borders. However, when the Great Plague struck both kingdoms, their population was also decimated. The Northmen were hit hard, as the sickness came with a cold winter their simple wooden abodes could not buffer. Half their people died, and the kingdom was slow to recover. Soon after, Gondor began to be attacked from the south by Wain Riders, nomadic men from the east who camped in fortified wagons. The invasions lasted nearly 100 years, and King Narmacil II of Gondor led an army into the plains south of Mirkwood to fight them off. However, he fell in battle, and Gondor was forced to abandon its lands east of the Anduin. The Northmen were scattered, and some of their people were gathered by Marwini and settled in the Vales of Anduin. After a time, King Calamatar, son of Narmacil II, looked to avenge the death of his father. Marwini warned him the Wain Riders planned to attack Calanardun, but that their enslaved Northmen were prepared to rebel. So Calamatar led a great force out of Ithilien into the open, hoping to bait the Wain Riders into battle. After a lengthy fight, Gondor emerged victorious, though a third of its soldiers were lost. Yet the Wain Riders were driven away, the first of the great alliances between Gondor and the people of the plains. But as peace settled over Gondor, the Wain Riders bided their time and waited for revenge. Over time, they formed alliances against their hated enemy, and planned for great attacks to assail Gondor from the north and south. Gondor remained wary, though not wholly prepared for the might of the inevitable attack, and King Ondoher divided his forces into a northern and southern army. The southern force was smaller, commanded by Eärnil at Pelargir. Ondoher had the reins of the northern army with his two sons Tarmir and Faramir. In 1944, the Wain Riders approached Pelargir. Eärnil crossed the Anduin, leaving the fords of the Poros defended. King Ondoher planned to deploy his men on the Dagorlad, but news reached him late of the Wain Riders' movements, and his army was not fully assembled on Dagorlad in time. They expected the attack to come from the north or northeast, but instead, the Wain Riders came from the east, moving along the arid Lithui. A massive cavalry and chariot charge smashed into the flanks of the army of Gondor, and the guard of Ondoher was utterly destroyed, the king and his son Artamir slain. Minotaur, captain of the right wing, took command, rallying the center and left wing and taking a defensive position between Caer Andros and the mountains of Ephel Duach. Messengers were sent to Eärnil in the south, warning him of the disastrous developments. The main assault of the Wain Riders, however, was delayed, for their first charge, though devastating, was done in haste and now left the main force disorganized. They lost track of Minotaur's army, believing he had retreated, and the road to Gondor itself was now wide open. Meanwhile, the younger son of Ondoher, Faramir, was commanded to stay behind but snuck into a company of Eotheod. However, they were ambushed in the first charge and driven into the dead marshes, and Faramir was slain. The Wain Riders, however, drove into Ithilien and fell upon Minotaur's rearguard. There Minotaur fell, and disaster would have befallen Gondor had the Wain Riders not led up to celebrate. This gave time for Eärnil, who was victorious in the south, to ambush the Wain Rider main camp. The invaders were destroyed in the Battle of the Camp, and Eärnil became king. This claim was contested by Ardavui of Arthedain in the north, husband of Ondoher's daughter and of the line of Isildur. Yet the Dunedain chose Eärnil to rule, and Ardavui did not press his claim. He would continue to defend the divided realms of Arnor from Angmar until the attack of the Witch King in 1974. Eärnil had sent his son Eärnur to aid in the battle, but they arrived too late and learned Arthedain had fallen and Ardavui perished. Eärnur then sailed for the Grey Havens of Lindon, and from that land came a great force of the elves of Círdan and men of Gondor and Rovanion, all to challenge the Witch King of Angmar. The Witch King had settled in Fornost, but now marched out and met the host of the west on the plain between Nenuyal and the North Downs. The black forces of Angmar were driven back, and Eärnur himself faced off with the Witch King. Fear fell upon all who beheld him, but he singled out the captain of Gondor for the fullness of his hatred, and with a terrible cry he rode straight upon him. Eärnur tried to stand his ground, but his horse turned and fled. But then, Glorfindel, the mightiest of elves of old, rode up and drove the Witch King away. The Witch King fled, and Glorfindel warned the men of Gondor not to pursue him, for he foretold his death was far off and would be by the hands of no man. Eärnur heeded these words, but was bitter, for his pride was wounded. This Glorfindel was the one and same elf who died fighting the Balrog in the flight of the exiles of Gondolin. As the spirits of elves are bound to Arda, it was within the power of the Valar to restore life to them in Valinor. Glorfindel was one of these elves, and was resurrected and sent back to Valinor. This was done as reward for his great deeds in the wars against Morgoth, and was truly an elf of terrible, nearly angelic power. It is implied he journeyed back to Middle-earth then with the Astari Gandalf, to aid him in the strengthening of the peoples of Middle-earth. There he helped the strength of Elrond and Gil-galad in the Second Age, acting as an emissary of the Valar of sorts. And now the Nazgul returned to avenge Angmar, and Sauron began to take form once more. The Ringwraiths struck in 2002 of the Third Age, taking the abandoned tower of Minas Ithil, transforming it into Minas Morgul and beginning war with Minas Anor. And Eärnur, still wounded in pride from the first battle with the Witch King, felt now his prowess in arms was mighty. In 2050, he rode to the gates of Minas Morgul and challenged the Witch King of Angmar to a duel, but was taken captive and never seen again. The line of kings ended there, and the stewards of House Mardil took charge of the kingdom of Gondor. The descendants of the kings were now far and few between, and the crown of Elendil laid unworn in the houses of the dead. Gondor now passed to the rule of the stewards, who were called the House of Hurin. Bearing only a simple white rod, their vows were to rule in the name of the king until he returned, but over time the stewards began to cling to power, despite rumors the ancient line of the north still lived. In the year 2002, the Seeing Stone in Ithil was lost, and eventually the only ones remaining in the hands of men were in Minas Tirith and Orthanc. It was presumed the Ithil stone fell into the hands of Sauron, who was then able to corrupt the stone in Orthanc and the one in Minas Tirith in the hands of Denethor the Steward. Denethor came to power in 2984, and it was of great might and wisdom. However, times were troublesome in Gondor, and he felt compelled to consult the Palantir in his tower. Denethor used his Palantir, the Anor Stone, to learn much of the wider events around him, and Sauron himself soon came to be aware of this. He attempted to wrest control of the stone away from Denethor, but the steward remained steadfast in his battle against Sauron and never ceded. Also aiding in this battle of wills was the fact that Sauron had stolen his stone. Denethor had rightfully inherited his from the line of Elendil, and thus his strength and integrity was bolstered by that unseen power. However, Sauron was nonetheless able to instill fear and hopelessness in the mind of Denethor by making him believe victory was impossible. It was only through great deception that the pride and strength of mind of Denethor crumbled. There were 24 stewards of the Kingdom of Gondor following the first, Mardil Voronwe, and ending with Denethor II. Yet in the years of Denethor I, in 2475 the first Uruk-hai appeared out of Mordor. They took Ithilien and Osgiliath, but Boromir, son of Denethor I, was able to recapture the first city. Osgiliath was ruined, and Boromir suffered a wound that lessened his life with pain thereafter, and died 12 years later. Time passed, and the Horsemen of the North had now drifted north of the Mirkwood, farther from Gondor but still maintaining communications with their ally. In the year 2489 of the Third Age, Cirion became steward of Gondor. He was wary of the mustering of Gondor's enemies in the north once more, but the Northmen lay a perilous distance away now. Cirion learned of a massive enemy force allied with orcs being gathered, and out of desperation sent messengers to the Eotheod, a journey of nearly 1,000 miles. The lord of the Eotheod was Earl, a courageous and wise man 25 years of age. Cirion hoped he would honor the ancient friendship between the two kingdoms, and gathered his men and marched to Calenardon, leaving his son Halas at Minas Tirith. One of the messengers, Borondir, managed to make it to Earl after a 15-day trek. Earl vowed to march to the aid of Gondor, and assembled the full might of the Eotheod for a great ride. Some 7,000 riders flew down the Vales of Anduin, skirting around the dark land of Dol Guldur. At last they arrived at the field of Celebrant, where Cirion had been overwhelmed by the wild men. Calenardon had been overrun, and the northern army of Gondor was in danger of breaking. Then Earl's riders fell upon the enemy's rear, saving Gondor. As reward, they were given the land of Calenardon, and Cirion vowed to stand against Earl's enemies as if they were his own. Earl took the title of the first king of the Mark of Riders, lord of the Eotheod and king of Calenardon. Mark signified a borderland, and was called Rohan and Sindarin, and its people the Rohirrim. Later, under the rule of Beren, the 19th Steward, 3 large fleets of corsairs attacked Gondor from Umbar, allied with the Haradrim. At this time, Saruman presented himself to the men of the West, and was given the keys to Isengard. He appeared a friend to them, but in secret wished to claim the secrets of the Seeing Stone. Rohan was flush with invaders as well, and its king at the time was the great Helm Hammerhand. Among his counselors was one Freka, a rich, powerful, and independent-minded lord. Freka proposed to Helm that his son marry the king's daughter, and was coldly rebuffed. He insulted Helm publicly, and the king responded by leading him out into a field, away from the main city of Edoras. Helm would not tolerate the insults of Freka, and struck him with such force that it killed him where he stood. Freka's son Wulf and his allies then fled, and 4 years later, the Corsairs attacked Rohan and Gondor. Helm Hammerhand was driven from the crossings of Isen and took refuge in the Hornburg, which became known as Helm's Deep. Wulf, son of Freka, seized the moment and took Edoras, proclaiming himself king, and Haleth, son of Helm, died defending the doors from the usurpers. Meanwhile, Helm was besieged in the Hornburg, and a long winter then fell upon Rohan. Helm continued to fight on, losing his other son to an ill-advised, desperate foray into the snow for food and supplies. The king of Rohan fell into a terrible grief, and took his pain out on the Dunlendings, the cruel men from the land of Dunland. He would go out by himself, clad in white, and stalk like a snow troll in the camps of his enemies and slay many men with his hands. It was believed that if he bore no weapon could bite on him. The Dunlendings said that if he could find no food, he ate men. Every time Helm ventured out, he blew his great horn, and it echoed in the deep and instilled a great fear in his enemies. This carried on until one morning Helm failed to return. The men of Rohan then saw a still figure standing on the horizon. It was Helm Hammerhand, dead but his knees remaining unbent. Elsewhere, Freyalaf, nephew of Helm, recaptured Edoras and slew Wulf. Aid from Gondor came at last to the horsemen, and the invaders were driven out in 2759. Helm was buried in a mound, where it is said the white cymbalmine, flowers that bloomed year-round, grew most thickly. These mounds were laid in rows below Edoras, and 2 lines would be formed for each line of the king. During this time, war came to the dwarves in the Misty Mountains in 2793, where they were beset by orcs. In Gondor, the 21st steward Belecthor II died, and with him perished the White Tree in Minas Tirith, though it was left standing. Gondor's power became greatly diminished, and under the rule of Turin II, Sauron began to grow in power. Ithilien was deserted, and orcs from Mordor began to wander the land while the Haradrim occupied the south of Gondor. Then King Fulkwine of Rohan, the 5th king of the 2nd line after Helm Hammerhand, honored the oath of Earl and sent aid to Gondor and helped Turin win a great victory, though his 2 sons fell in battle. And then Turgon became the ruling steward, and during his time Sauron openly declared himself, raising Barad-dûr in Mordor while Saruman began to fortify Isengard. Ecthelion II succeeded Turgon, and wisely began to strengthen the border defenses against Mordor. He was aided by a mysterious captain named Thorongil, a great leader of men who wore a silver star and once served King Thengel of the Rohirrim. Though renowned, his true identity was a mystery. He counseled Ecthelion II to crush the Umbar rebels in the south, and in a great battle destroyed their ships. But Thorongil did not return to Gondor, saying instead he had other tasks at hand, and he passed over the Anduin. The departure of Thorongil hit Gondor hard, except for one Denethor II, son of the steward. For Denethor II had access to the Seeing Stone of Minas Tirith, and though Thorongil in his heart had no desire for political mastery and lordship of Gondor, Denethor mistrusted him. This was due in part to Denethor trusting the intentions of Saruman the White, while being wary of Gandalf the Grey. It was suspected later after his death that Denethor had perceived the true heritage of Thorongil, and falsely believed he and Gandalf were looking to usurp him. Nonetheless, Denethor II became steward of Gondor in 2984 of the Third Age, and proved to be a wise and strong ruler. He married Finduilas in 2976, but she died 12 years later, leaving him grim and quiet. He began to use the Palantir more, and he grew to know much about the happenings in the world, though he was slowly filled with despair. The only solace he found was in his eldest son Boromir, for his other son Faramir displeased him for heeding the words and counsels of Gandalf. Elsewhere, though the kingdom of Arnor was in ruins, its line still yet lived. For Arathorn II, son of Arador, remained alive as one of the Dúnedain, and he was of the line of Elendil, the youngest son of Isildur. He married Gilrain the Fair, and 1 year later became chieftain of the Dúnedain. They had a son named Aragorn, and when he was only 2 years old, Arathorn was slain by an orc arrow to the eye. Aragorn was then sent to the safe havens of Rivendell under the care of Elrond, where he was named Estil, meaning hope. His true identity as heir to the kingdoms of men remained a secret, and it was thus believed the line of northern kings was broken. When Estil was 20 years old and grown to be a fair and noble man, Elrond told him his true identity and presented the heirlooms of his house, the ancient ring of Barahir and the shards of Narsil. The scepter of Anu Minas was not given over yet, for Elrond decreed that must be earned. The next day, Aragorn walked in the woods, singing the Lay of Luthien. Suddenly, he saw a beautiful elven woman with dark hair, so striking he called out to Nuviel. But instead, she was Arwen, daughter of Elrond, who by chance was visiting Rivendell at the time, and Aragorn was captured by her beauty and loved her. Now his mother urged caution, for she believed that Aragorn may not receive Elrond's blessing to take his daughter's hand, for she was of the immortal Eldar and he a mortal Edain. But Elrond soon learned of Aragorn's desire for Arwen and summoned him. He warned Aragorn that it was foreseen he would not wed until he was worthy of the kingship and surpassed the deeds of his fathers before him. Additionally, he warned that Arwen was also subject to leaving Middle-earth with him when the elves left for the Grey Havens. For Elrond knew dark times were ahead, and though Aragorn showed much potential, he would face many trials that could lead to his doom. So Aragorn left Rivendell, and for 30 years he labored in great deeds against Sauron, taking the counsel of Gandalf the Wise often. He served with the Rohirrim and the Lords of Gondor, becoming wise beyond any other man and renowned in might, though none knew his true background. But all the while his face was grim, for the doom laid upon him wore on his heart. When he was 49 years old, Aragorn went to Lothlorien to stay in the company of the Lady Galadriel. She clad him in fine white garments and a bright gem, and the air of Isildur in that moment appeared truly spectacular. He walked in the woods of Lothlorien, and by chance came across Arwen once more. And as he came walking towards her under the trees of Caras Galadhon laden with flowers of gold, her choice was made and her doom appointed. They walked Lothlorien together, coming to the hill of Caran Amrah, where they were betrothed. Arwen in doing so chose a mortal life, foregoing her immortality and place in Valinor. This grieved Elrond, for he knew of both their dooms, but he would not suffer his daughter to marry any less a man than the rightful king of Gondor and Arnor, and Aragorn was sent away on more missions while Arwen stayed in Rivendell. In Imladris, some elves also dwelled there under the lordship of Círdan. Of the ancient elven rings of Sauron, Elrond still held the Ring of Sapphire, and Galadriel the Ring of Adamant in Lothlorien. Círdan the Shipwright, the eldest and most far-sighted of them all, bore the Red Ring of Ruby. For a time, their realms knew peace, but it was foretold that upon either the return of Sauron or the destruction of their One Ring, the elven rings would lose their power and Imladris and Lothlorien would begin to fade. As the dwarves continued their labors into the mountains, the dominion of men spread across Middle-earth, and the elves continued to pass into twilight. But the dwarves dug deep, driven by a deepening desire for Mithril, and they awoke a Balrog of Morgoth, an ancient terror of the First Age. Durin was killed, and within a year the mines of Moria fell into squalor, the dwarves of that once proud realm forced to flee. They were led by Thrain I, grandson of Durin, and they came to Erebor, the lonely mountain. There their people were rebuilt, and Thrain was crowned as king under the mountain. His prized possession was the Arkenstone, a jewel of unfathomable light and beauty. Thorin I, son of Thrain I, led a gathering to the Grey Mountains, but that land became beset by many dragons. There fell Dane the First and one of his sons Fror at the hands of a cold drake. The Grey Mountains were abandoned, and Dane's other son Gror settled in the Iron Hills with many dwarves. Thror, heir of Dane, and his uncle Borin returned to Erebor with the others. The kingdom grew and prospered, forming a friendship with the men who lived by the waters there. Yet one day, Smaug the Golden learned of the wealth of the mountain and attacked. Erebor and the nearby town of Dale were destroyed, and Smaug settled in vast beds of gold in its great halls. The dwarves of Erebor became displaced, wandering the lands with no home. After some years, a disgraced Thror gave Thrain the last of the 7 dwarven rings. He then set out for Azanulbizar in the mines of Moria with a lone companion named Nar. Perhaps crazed in the mind, he walked through the open gates, standing tall, but did not return. Nar waited until a body was thrown outside and a dark, evil voice spoke to him. Walking forward, he saw the body was Thror's, the head severed and with the name Azog carved into it. Thrain learned of his father's death and wept with rage. The dwarves then went to war with the orcs of Azog, and many grievous battles were fought in the deeps of the earth. Thrain mustered his forces and allies for 3 years, then marched with the full might of Durin's folk. Both sides were pitiless, and there was death and cruel deeds by dark and by light. But the dwarfs had the victory through their strength and their matchless weapons in the fire of their anger, as they hunted for Azog in every den under mountain. The final battle of Azanulbizar was in front of Moria itself, and there the dwarves and the last vestige of orcs under the mountains were evenly matched. Then Azog himself came to battle and slew Nain. But Dane Ironfoot, young for a dwarf at this time, leapt forward and killed Azog, cutting off his head, and the dwarfs gained the upper hand. Khazad-dûm and Moria were reclaimed, but half the fighting dwarves had been lost. But into the realm of old they would not enter, for the Bane of Durin still resided there. Thrain and Thorin returned to Dunland, and the number of dwarves slowly began to grow once more. Now Thrain still had the Dwarven Ring, the last to remain free from Sauron, but dwarves could not have their wills bent to another, and thus the ring would only ever deepen their greed for treasure. In this measure, Sauron could never hope to control the dwarves, but they nonetheless were subject to dooms of their own making. One day Thrain, perhaps driven by the ring's influence, decided to set out for Erebor. He left his son Thorin suddenly, wandering for years. Thrain was captured and taken to Dol Guldur, where he was tortured and killed, and the last ring was taken. His heir, Thorin Oakenshield, was 95 years of age, and though he had a large number of people and fair lands to his name, his heart began to seek revenge against Smaug and to retake Erebor. Then one year, a darkness rose in Greenwood the Great, and shadows and foul beasts began to stalk that land, the realm of King Thranduil. The forest became known as Mirkwood, and only the wise knew that Sauron was the cause of this. For he had returned, and though the whole of Middle-earth was not aware of it yet, the evil sorcerer of Dol Guldur was the ancient enemy himself. At this time, the Astari, known as Wizards to Men, appeared in Middle-earth. Only Círdan, Galadriel, and Elrond knew that they had come from over the sea, and were believed to be messengers of the Valar. Their purpose was to contest the power of Sauron, and galvanize the beings of Middle-earth to valiant deeds if the need arose. The Astari journeyed far and wide over the years, never seeming to age, and were numbered among the wisest of beings. Among them was Curunir, or better known as Saruman. He was the first Astari to arrive on Middle-earth, and went most in the company of men, and was skilled in smithing. Saruman would take up an abode in Orthanc in the Ring of Isengard. Mithrandir, or Gandalf, was close friends with the elves. He was the first to ascertain the true source of the darkness in Mirkwood, for many believed it to be the Nazgul, and not actually Sauron. To Mithrandir, Círdan gifted the Red Ring, to be kept safe from Sauron. Take this ring, master, for your labors will be heavy, but it will support you in the weariness that you have taken upon yourself. For this is the Ring of Fire, and with it you may rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill. But as for me, my heart is with the sea, and I will dwell by the grey shores until the last ship sails. I will await you." However, Saruman soon learned of this, and a bitter jealousy grew in him that would manifest into hate. There were other Astari as well who ventured east, whose tales are unknown, but in the western lands there was also Radagast, friend of all animals. Gandalf confronted the sorcerer of Dol Guldur, who fled. However, the shadow of evil persisted, and the White Council was held with all the remaining elven lords and the Astari. Saruman began to study the lore of the Rings of Power and was elected chief of the council, though Galadriel advocated for Gandalf. But Gandalf refused, wanting to remain independent, and Sauron's desire for mastery grew as well as his pride. Later, Gandalf journeyed again to Dol Guldur and discovered the return of Sauron, and he and Elrond knew the enemy would soon begin to search once more for the One Ring. Saruman remained skeptical, believing the ring to be long lost in the depths of the world, but Elrond and Gandalf were troubled nonetheless. "Many are the strange chances of the world," said Mithrandir, "and help oft shall come from the hands of the weak when the wise falter." The White Council was wary of darkness returning to Middle-earth, but unknown to them, Saruman had already turned to evil thoughts. He became fixated with finding the ring for himself, hoping to strike when it appeared again, if at all. Isengard was fortified against Sauron, who he now perceived as a rival in the White Council. Gandalf continued to urge the council to action, advocating that Sauron be driven out of Dol Guldur. "It is not needed that the ring should be found, for while it abides on earth and is not unmade, still the power that it holds will live, and Sauron will grow and have hope. The might of the elves and elf friends is less now than of old. Soon he will be too strong for you, even without the great ring. For he rules the 9, and of the 7 he has recovered 3. Saruman relented, and the council rallied and drove Sauron out of Dol Guldur, briefly restoring peace to Mirkwood. However, Sauron simply retreated to Mordor, where he re-raised the Tower of Barad-dûr and began to muster his legions of orcs. Saruman withdrew to Isengard and never reappeared as part of the White Council. Dark times loomed on the horizon, and Gandalf became ever vigilant of the One Ring, seeking for its reappearance in the world and continuing to muster strength in Middle-earth to oppose Sauron. By chance, he traveled to the village of Bree, where he encountered Thorin Oakenshield, heir to the kingdom under the mountain. Gandalf saw an opportunity, for he was concerned about Smaug, and worried Sauron may try to bring the great dragon to his side. Thorin listened to Gandalf and invited him to his halls. "I will come," said Gandalf, "for I guess that we share one trouble at least. The dragon of Erebor is on my mind, and I do not think that he will be forgotten by the grandson of Thor." And so the stage was set for one of the greatest and final battles of the Third Age, the one to mark the end of the Eldar and beginning of the Age of Men. But the catalyst for these last great acts of heroism would come from a most unexpected source. For in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit.